When it comes to cybersecurity, the biggest threats are the ones you never see coming. SecureWorks detects and responds to cyber attackers' ever-changing tactics. We come armed with Taegis, a security analytics platform designed to recognize attacks and stop them before they do harm. SecureWorks, defending every corner of cyberspace. Learn more at securityweekly.com/SecureWorks. Can your incident response technology collect from off-network endpoints? Xterra FTK Enterprise can. Endpoints are no longer located in a physical office, and organizations need a comprehensive investigation tool that enables holistic data collection and review. With FTK Enterprise, you can also scan for IOCs and MISP indicators. You can scan with Yara rules, and you can use integrations to trigger automatic endpoint collections. Visit securityweekly.com/Xterra for access to their white paper, Incident Response for a Remote World. The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation of cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, and prove compliance in audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms, which include YouTube and Twitch. All right, for our second interview today, Dr. James Norrie joins us to talk about a human defense platform, fortifying your last mile of cybersecurity defense. Dr. James Norrie is a tenured professor of strategy, cybersecurity, and law, and former dean of the Graham School of Business at York College of Pennsylvania. He has terminal degrees. You might have to explain this to me. Terminal degrees in business and law. I guess terminal just means that's where your doctorates come from, right?
That's crazy academic speak.
You're not dying from them, then. That's
no, not yet.
It seemed like there's kind of like a dual thing, like a little bit of a joke. I don't know if that's intended or not, but. And graduate degrees in education, psychology, engineering, and cybersecurity. So clearly you love academia, and you found some way to bring it into to leverage it as a founder, right?
I did. So, I go into my lab and I try and solve what scientists often call persnickety problems. Those problems which at the boundaries and the edges maybe defy rational solutions. So I have a tendency to go into my lab and I start to play around. And I always swear I'm never going to do another startup. And I always end up doing one anyway, Adrian. So I don't know what that says to your audience about me. But anyway, so startup number 5 and out of the lab, because we have a patented solution now. For those of you who want to look it up and you're interested, you can. It's 11411978. US patent number. But anyway, the patent is interesting because it talks about something that blends the best of cybersecurity with the best of behavioral science to bring real results to human factors challenges in cyberspace. And as you and I have talked about in the prep interview, I think this is the last real boundary of unconquered and unbridled risk. And often in our profession, I think our CISOs and our chief risk officers and other folks who are struggling with this problem would like that distance between the computer and the chair to be occupied by a programmable human, but they're not. And so the product was born. And so that's how I became both an academic and a founder again.
And I didn't even get to the, I didn't even finish, because already there was something to talk about there. But welcome to the show, James. And, the last thing I was going to mention is that you are the founder and CEO of Cyberconic.
I sure am. Thank you for that.
Yeah, definitely. And a very fascinating topic to us. Absolutely see a ton of efforts and funding and products and research into this problem, because as much AI and technology and machine learning, and intel gathering we do, when I do a lot of breach postmortems, and generally they start with somebody tricking somebody into doing something. Like we actually had a segment last week on the Uber breach, because since the attacker shared a lot of details of how they allegedly did it, there was some stuff to talk about there, certainly enough for a 30-minute segment, and some lessons to be learned from it. And one of those was, managing to add themselves to the multi-factor authentication for an account that they stole, which, I think for a while now, like we tend to relax a lot more once we have multi-factor authentication in place, but this attack shows, a lot of that is defeatable too with some well-planned social engineering.
Sure. Or maybe some not so well-planned social engineering. I mean, how many friends who've been hit with the whole, you're my friend on my Facebook account, and to verify that you have to release my account, you have to, send me the number that's going to pop up. And if you think you know the person, you don't get suspicious. Well, in fact, it's a hacked account. So I truly am amazed by sometimes the level of trust we exhibit to things that are online. It's part of the accidental insider phenomenon. And of course, in terms of security behaviors, for the longest time, none of us had to worry about two-factor authentication because we were, doing things that didn't require that level of sophistication online. And now I think companies are transacting, business at scale, and the human problem is the rampant problem. And part of that is the way humans trust or don't trust and behave online. And I think there's just a lot for us to talk about around that because it's a complex problem.
And I think you make an excellent point there. Sometimes even bad social engineering works for a certain percentage of the population. And that's that gets to the core of what Cybercon IQ is focusing on here is, some of your employees, not everybody has the same level of resilience to these types of attacks, right?
Right. And actually, if I might, I'm going to describe a little graphic for your viewers who are listening to us, but we actually have done a fair bit of research, thousands and thousands of hours, assessing from real attack data. So these are real vulnerabilities, Adrian. What caused one person to fall for an attack and another person not to? And as a behavioral scientist, that's an incredibly intriguing problem because it means that different people are vulnerable to different things. Or as we like to say in our model, all styles are valuable, but all styles are vulnerable. So if you looked at us, what we figured out is that a large percentage of the way we behave online is actually quite predictable, but it's not predictable from our past behavior. So I'm not talking about predictive analytics where somebody's behavior online makes them a risk. What makes them a risk actually is their personality and the way they perceive the world. So if you were to see this in front of you, you would see a basic 4-quadrant model with the degree to which somebody is risk averse or risk tolerant on the one hand. And that's something we all know about ourselves. And I can use examples if you want in a second. But the one that is really subject to the patent and which is harder to figure out with these folks is why do they sometimes follow the rules and sometimes not? And what parts of our personality drive us in combination at various different times to behave in a way that either puts us at risk or avoids risk? So for me as a behavioral scientist, this is incredibly interesting stuff. And I could certainly give examples if that's helpful to your audience, but I think the model stands alone. It really, for most people who see it, they go, yeah, that makes sense.
Can I ask a kind of an outside question around a more, I don't know, theoretically, do you feel that the end user is responsible, and as an organization, do you feel it is their job for us to train them to identify these social engineering attacks? And does it actually matter? Like, I will always get a social engineering attack in. I will always make it work. Just depends on the risk adversity of the organization and how much like a threat actor they want me to really become, because they will always find ways to break or leverage a user's job function against them. If that's their job function, I'll use it against them and find a way to break it. That's what hackers do. So is it really the employee's job to know that and identify it? Or should we be coming up with more intriguing ways and innovative ways to technologically protect our end users?
Well, the point you just made, which I think is a good one, is what is the likelihood, the extent to which as you point out, since there's a novel threat all the time, and there's a novel threat on the machine side about every 1.3 seconds, something like that. If you're to look at the bad guys using AI and the degree to which they can create automated memes, I think your point is a much more substantially interesting one. If a hacker really wants to turn somebody, your argument is they probably can. But then that's the same reason that the technical defenses argument fails. So at the perimeter of all of our organizations, I think most of my most sophisticated clients do an excellent job of repelling threats and making sure that the behaviors and the tools that are going to be used by hackers generally, if they can be detected, never ever land in front of the employees. So really what we're talking about for my client base, at least, is 90 to 93, maybe 94% effective most of the time at repelling threats or limiting the ability of some kind of intrusion or vulnerability to be exploited to create that accidental insider. But there's always going to be that effort by a hacker to turn somebody, and that person is the only person who can stop the attack at that point. So if we don't train them, the likelihood of both being attacked successfully and the extent of that attack rise. And we know that from research we've done, and I'd be happy to share it. But let's just say that it is the last mile of the human firewall for the most novel threat that worries me the most. And it worries me the most because if we don't train people to not look for the content, but to look for the context, what is it that makes them vulnerable? What are the things that give them that sort of spidey sense, the tingling in the back of their neck? What causes them perhaps to rethink something and validate or verify outside the chain? Like, we have to give them the basics. So at least there's a fighting chance, because I think that's what we don't give them if we don't train them, is a fighting chance.
So we're building a human EDR. They're actually looking for behaviorals and not IOCs, which I think is fantastic. That is actually the way that we should be doing this.
Well, right. And so I think you're on to sort of the methodology. The reason this system works so effectively and we get these really incredible results is because we don't care what the meme of the attack is, and we don't care necessarily what specific vulnerability the bad guy is trying to socially engineer. We want to teach people some pretty basic stuff. And again, we can repel repeatedly 96 to 98% of even the most sophisticated multi-factor hybrid attacks, as an example, which are hard. They are very successful. They can be very anxiety making. We can teach employees how to spot the tricks that really make it clear they're being manipulated. So if you're talking about accidental insiders, and we should be talking about people who are generally loyal and who want to be successfully loyal to their companies being hacked, as opposed to somebody who's deliberately criminal or who's a sociopath, which, by the way, I just want to tell you, there's a lot of high-functioning sociopaths, research says, that are executives in large companies. So there's also that kind of irony, which is somebody who wants to be sociopathic can always quite typically manipulate a lot of this stuff very successfully. But if you have somebody who wants to be loyal and do the right thing, there's a lot we can teach them to avoid even the most sophisticated social engineering hacks.
So building on what Tyler said, it's interesting from my perspective what you're talking about. Certainly looking at the human and figuring out how to help the human recognize these things, like you said, the spidey sense perspective of it. And certainly companies have invested a lot of money in email filtering, different degrees, whether it explodes an attachment or it's looking at certain heuristics using AI, ML, what have you. But ultimately, as we know, these messages do reach the humans, and more attackers are also reaching out to other platforms beyond just email, so Slack, Teams, and other things. I've seen a number of breaches where the email has come in and the person opened up or downloaded the zip file and opened it up many, many times and ran it over and over again because there was nothing that they thought was unusual about it. How do you feel about figuring out the behavior of email versus Slack versus Teams versus something else? Because I think for a lot of users, they look at email as this external thing and Slack and Teams as this internal thing. How do we rewire the brain to really look at these different collaboration platforms as all kind of the same ingress point into the environment?
So again, I think both Tyler and now Sean, you make the same kind of point. The sophistication of these attacks is growing, and what you're referring to, which are hybrid attacks that happen on platforms that have some kind of halo trust effect, right? So one of the things we teach people is that the halo of trust is only as good as our ability to make sure that the people inside that halo are to be trusted. So it is important to understand the differences between human behavior and inclination or impulse or instinct. So, for instance, what I frequently tell people is that my sense of trusting somebody is changed often by their position or social connection to me, something like that. So let's use a real example. Somebody's coming from inside your network, and it appears as if for some reason those people are to be trusted because you know those people. If you think you know that person and that person is doing something that is unusual or has not been detected before in your pattern, that's perhaps a sign you need to step outside of that chain and validate and verify who they are. So ultimately, the kinds of things we're teaching people are not about the easy to repel threats that are never really going to be a problem. And I know many CISOs are very proud of the rate at which they repel threats. I'm talking about that thing that gets in front of the employee. And unless they're using not rules, because generic rules won't help, but also generic rules will not be applied by all of your employees consistently, unless they're using judgment to figure out what to do. And we use a mnemonic called save yourself from yourself. Unless we can interrupt their instincts and impulses, get them to stop and do something different, we will never prevent the attack. So our job actually is to get them to stop first. And that's a huge part of what we're teaching them. When do they need to stop?
So does that approach also work well? And I assume you're going to say yes, but how does that approach work well from the perspective of pivoting from email to another methodology, a phone call or something like that, where the CFO of an organization is being contacted by the CEO or receives another message from them, or a text message even, which is something that's happening more prevalently now as well, saying, I need you to transfer this money to this account, or in smaller situations, in other issues, which we've certainly seen before, getting a text message about buying gift cards or certain types of gift cards and sending those somewhere. How do you feel like this same approach can be applied to that? And what do you think are some of the key differences in the way that people's brains process that sort of approach or that request differently than they do with your standard email phish?
Right. So let's return again to this idea about the human behavior element of this. So, Sean, let me ask you a question. Presumably you have your text messages saved with names as opposed to phone numbers. Would that be accurate?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So if you were going to get a text message, and I'm air quoting this now. So Sean, you're going to get a text message from the CEO, right? That's what you're saying?
Right.
If the CEO had talked to you and sent you phone calls or text messages before, you would know that that was the CEO, right?
Correct.
Okay. So what would unsettle you is if we added urgency or emergency or anxiety that broke down a simple insight for you, which is if you get what appears to be a random text that the person claims to be your CEO, and it's from a number, whether you recognize the number or you think you do or you don't, isn't that outside the norm? Because normally on your phone, it would have shown up as the CEO.
Absolutely. And there's often some sort of pretext that explains that, which I think is part of the other thing that you're getting to, right?
Good. So you're right. So we're down the right path, but let me just keep going. So now you're going to say, well, yeah, but then if it was a pretext, I would say to the CEO, well, I don't recognize this number. Is that what you would do? Tell me what you would do. It's clear you've gotten it. They claim they're the CEO. What would you do?
Well, what I would do, I would probably string them along for a while I contact the other people. But
that's because you're a podcast host and you like toying with people. So that's not fair, actually. So that's, if it was your CEO and you weren't playing with them, what would you do?
I would have to confirm through other means other than the standard, other than that text message. A standard thing for confirming a request that seems unusual on the message media that it was received on.
Perfect. So if you knew those basic rules, we've probably taken care of some of the attack vectors, but what we haven't done is tell you the kinds of things that they might do that would trick you further. So then we might have to deal with teaching the person how to detect not something that's simple, because that's a relatively simple example, but to watch out for spoofing or to watch out for hybrid attacks that involve you opening an email with a trigger and they send you a confirming text message, as you say, from a number that's masked as if it was Microsoft Security or an authority figure. So that simple example you used is a simple example, but there's actually quite a bit more complexity to this, because what I'll tell you is that you can't teach people one size fits all rules. The rules will determine not just what we do, because the simple one you gave is that, but let's assume you're dealing with different personalities. So I'm going to go back, if I may, and just re-show you the graphic that shows the quadrants. The quadrants in our model are important because of how they behave. And for people who are just listening to us, I've got the 4-quadrant model up with the risk on the vertical and rule breaking and abiding on the horizontal. But what's kind of neat is, and Sean, let's assume for a second that you have somebody who's down in that quadrant of being risk averse and rule following. They will not actually fall for man-in-the-middle attacks or any of those things you've talked about, because it's so out of the ordinary they can sense, and they don't even believe the pretext. They would rather get in trouble for not having fallen for the pretext than to execute on the CEO's responsibilities. And that is so endemic to their personality that we hardly even have to explain it to them. And in fact, when you try and train them on it, they kind of look at you dumbly, and they would say something, Sean, like this. They would say, are there people dumb enough to fall for that pretext? Because it's obviously not the CEO. So that's one quadrant. Now let's zip up for our listeners again who are just hearing the audio track. If I were to go up to the top left corner where you have people who are both rule breaking and very risk tolerant, they might not even stop to apply the rule, because guess what? Your rules are not as good as my judgment. So I'm going to decide for myself whether it's the CEO, and your rules don't really matter. So I'm not going to do that. So we have to train them somewhat differently. We have to say, okay, you have deep trust in your own judgment, and you're rolling our eyes. We say, your judgment's great. We're sure you'd never fall for this, but we think you should model the behavior of just making sure, because you're a team leader and that models the behavior for others, or because we think that's the good thing to do or so. So we know enough about these quadrants to also, quite frankly, train them not just on what they need to do, but to get them to actually do it. So we present it differently in different ways, because generic training, if you're training everybody in your organization the same way, you are not going to get an even application of the rule. So Sean, I'll bet you, had I asked that same question about what you do with the CEO's number to other people on, maybe to Adrian or to Tyler or to Katie, I think we might get different answers. And because you're all different people. So if you give me a different answer about what you would do and why you would do it, I need to have a system that can adapt. And that's what this does. Everybody's journey through this is different. There is no generic training that will work. You have to treat people like they are smart and capable humans. They're part of the solution. And if you do that and you teach them how they can avoid their vulnerabilities, but also how they can maximize their own contribution to their own online safety, you get a very different outcome than what we're broadcasting today, which is people are the problem. And that negative sense of people are the problem creates a whole other issue for us in terms of compliance with even the basic rules. They begin to think that it won't matter because they're just going to get attacked anyway. How positive is that for a message for a company to deliver to its employees?
Does some of this kind of fall into the place where you can get that buy-in from the employees by tying it to something personal, where they're able to take this and leverage this at home or apply it to their home finances, their home security, getting that connection between the personal and what benefits the company, which is almost a secondary symptom of addressing a root cause, which people are selfish and they want something for themselves. So if we're providing that to them and that falls over to the enterprise, then that's just a bonus to them. Does that kind of fall into some of these categories?
Absolutely, Tyler. And it's a good point. Why would anybody do something if they exclusively thought it was for somebody else's benefit unless they were told to? And training often falls into that category. It's one of the reasons we distinguish between what is training and what is education. So training has an instrumental purpose for a company. It is designed to get you to comply and to do something. And so they make you march through it and you sort of dutifully do it. Ours is not that. Ours is exactly what you said. We want to provide an incentive where the employee learns something so deeply and fundamentally about themselves, something from their personality and the way their interior world sort of is, that they see it as something that's valuable, not just at work, but in fact, even more valuable at home. So you're right. There's an incentive system that if you can train people not to do something just for the company's benefit, but educate them about themselves and give them something that is truly valuable in their personal life, you are going to get better retention and better application of that. So that's obviously, we call that a sensitization effect. The other thing that we get that's really important is we have people who begin to realize that we know something about them and we've taught them something really valuable about how to avoid risk, and they're grateful. So, Adrian, I asked you this question before, but I'll ask you. I mean, when was the last time you asked somebody for more security training?
Never.
Okay, well, and this is the problem, right? Because it's grueling and it's not very interesting. And even those companies that are claiming sort of edutainment or gamification, I mean, it's not clear that that's working to relieve the tyranny of this issue. So this is fascinating. We study this on our platform because people have learned to trust that they're getting something of personal value. More than 3/4 of learners on our platform actually consume training not assigned to them. It's non-mandatory. They actually come to us looking for more information on things. This tells us something about the way we're approaching training, having a perception that the employee believes this is valuable because we've learned enough about them to give them the gift of education that matters back. And because so many people in this company are psychologists or educators or both, we know that learning is best done in a safe environment that incents learning and creates safe conditions for all people to learn differently. And that's what we're going to need to learn in security, is if we want to conquer this issue, because I'm going to be honest, we've had security awareness training out there for years and years, and it's not really conquering the problem. That probably means it's time to revisit this and ask ourselves a really basic question as professionals. Is that then on us? Are we training the right way? Are we training the right things? Are we able to find a method that stays ahead of the bad guys, quite frankly? Because if we don't solve this problem, cybercrime is a $100 billion problem globally. It takes billions of dollars a month out of the US economy. This is not a trivial problem, and we have to get it solved. And I would argue that the frontier of human exploitation is still one of the most successful for the crooks. And that's because they can make a lot of money with stuff like ransomware attacks that are almost always triggered with an intervening human factor. So we need to help our operators, our humans, our friends and our colleagues, our family avoid this problem, because it's a plague. A real plague.
So, Adrian and crew. Sorry, Adrian.
Sorry, I'll let you go ahead in just a moment here, but I'm willing to bet that each of us can remember the name of a teacher that we had at some point in college or high school that was really good. You know, and the point I'm making here is that it's probably not a long list. but there are a few teachers we had that just really stood out, and we remember what they taught, we remember their lessons, we remember their names, and then there's a whole bunch of it that we don't. And yeah, I think it might come down to something as simple as, you know, education that works and education that's quality, and most of what's out there is neither of those things.
Yeah. And, you know, Adrian, that's why I distinguish as well. I say to people, what is the point of training or education if it's not designed specifically to change behavior? That is the intention of education or training. So if you think about the context of what you just said and those really great educators that you remember because they made an impact, my guess is that the impact came as much for the context of how they taught and what they did to create the conditions in that classroom with you that enabled you to have that experience. That was a powerful distinction from the educators who simply gave you content and assumed it was self-evident that you needed to learn it. And I think that's what's really unsophisticated about our security industry right now. I know so many companies that are simply putting a check in the box. They've picked a vendor or done internal content, whatever they've done, and they feel that as long as they've checked the box and they've provided the information, it's bound to work. I mean, they just don't understand why it doesn't. So, Katie, you haven't had a chance to chat yet, but I'm going to ask you a simple question. So, Katie, have you ever made a New Year's resolution?
No.
Okay. So you're a bad example. So here I am trying to get you in the conversation. So let's try one of the guys then. Sean.
I make resolutions. I just don't make New Year's resolutions.
Okay. Well, okay. So they don't have to be New Year's, so they could be resolutions. And I would assume those resolutions are often because you know you should do something that's good for you.
Of course, yes.
Okay. And then the ability to actually make those resolutions work work depends on three things, right? It depends on your motivation to actually do that, whatever you've chosen as the resolution, right? So that's a factor.
Yes.
The capability, which is you actually know what you need to do to keep the resolution.
Yes, of course.
And then the third one is often the one that's elusive, which is you need the dedication to stay with that before that either becomes so hard you say you can't get there, or you get some early success and you slack off. And all three of those factors are really important. So it has to be something you're motivated to do. You have to have the ability to do it. And the achievement has to come in some kind of measured way. It can't be too quick, but it also can't take too long. It has to be achievable. So if we take, Katie, that exact same, those three things we know, and I say to you, okay, I've just put you through security training at work. How many of those factors are present for you to change your behavior? Are you motivated?
Yeah.
Maybe. Just because you've been trained for most people isn't quite enough. You probably also need a context for why you're being trained, why it's important, how. So the positioning of your training is almost as important as the training itself. And frequently you find with our clients, even if they have a not so great training program itself and it's generic and it may not be effective, it could be much more effective if we position the motivation, right? Yeah. Now, the capability. So does your training know anything about you today? Does it have any ability to make sure that we're training you in a way that you prefer to be trained or that you prefer to learn so you can actually apply that content?
That would be a critical element. Yeah, of course.
And if we are giving everybody the same training, we assume that simply by knowing something, it's bound to change your behavior. So if I just tell you something that's good for you, will you just automatically do it? No. And that's the problem with security training. So on that front, I think we don't always deliver the capability. And then the achievement of this is if your employees are still afraid. So there's a biopsych condition that's biologically, it's inherent in us as humans, right? Excuse me. And it's called hypervigilance. And hypervigilance occurs when there's a low level stasis of fear all the time that's present about a condition. So I'm wondering whether you would agree with me, Katie. I think a lot of people worry that they could get hacked or scammed, or they could lose something online. I think people are sometimes afraid because they know that this is a risk, right? So do you think there's people who are afraid?
Probably, yeah.
And if they're afraid, the motivation and the achievement lowers rather than increases. So psychologically, when people are afraid, you get a temporary fatigue-based kind of compliance, but you don't get this sense of achievement. We don't make people feel like part of the problem. Frequently, we make them feel like part of the problem. We don't make them feel like part of the solution. We don't give them much in the way of achievement. And so we've studied this problem. And if you want to get behavior change, you really need to do something different. And I don't think teaching everybody the same thing every way, as if a few simple rules will stop cybersecurity hacks and social engineering, I think that's actually unfair, because then when the person gets hacked anyway, who should they blame? Should they blame the training? I don't know the answer to that.
Only if the lawyers say so.
No, but the legal answer, Tyler, is it depends.
Right.
That's
the legal answer is a fascinating one we could all debate, because full disclosure, I'm a non-practicing attorney now. But yes, leave the legal question aside. I think the human question is really important here. How we put our programs together and what we do. And again, I'm just going to share this quick graphic, if that's okay. Can I just share something with your audience? Do you mind?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. So this is sort of what I say to people. If you were to take all of the research we know across all vendors of security awareness training, I think every single one of us would say that if you don't train your people, so Tyler, this goes to your earlier point, is it our responsibility to train the end user? And I think the answer should be yes. Is it perfect? No, it's an imperfect solution, but it's better than not training them. So the chart you see here is really simple, again, for our listeners, maybe without access to the visual. You have your sort of phishing prone rates on the side. Those are people who would fall for a de-weaponized safe internal phish, and many organizations phish their employees. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the practice. I think it catches people more frequently doing something wrong because we're more interested in who failed than celebrating how many people passed. But let's leave the psychology aside because we all do it. So you probably are going to start at a rate of phishing prone rates of between 30 and 40% if nobody's had any training at all. And then if you give them even some basic training, it begins to remediate quite quickly and it falls. And if you can get some basic training out there, some of the freeware, some of the other stuff you can probably get that rate down to maybe, I don't know, around 8 or 10%, something like that. But to really get the kinds of results you need to not just teach them, you also need to teach them and then detect whether or not they're applying it. And if they're not applying it, why they're not applying it. So that's a little more complicated. And that's what is kind of neat about us. It's not just that we have content, but we have content and assessment layered and laddered and blended together all the time. And they're working all the time to see whether people can apply the content. Because our view is, there's no point in training somebody if it doesn't change their behavior. So we actually look for the behavior change. So that'll get you down low again, maybe in the 5 to 8% range. But to really, really get to effectively the minimum, the lowest theoretical possible risk, which is in our clients' cases, always sub 2% on phishing prone rates, most of them somewhere between 0.3 and 0.7. To get to those low rates, you have to do two other things. You have to have a way to remediate that doesn't involve putting people through the same training that caused them to fail the first time. So you have to do a different thing on remediation, because the issue in remediation is they knew, they just kind of didn't apply it in the moment. So what we want to do is help them understand what they missed. So we remediate them differently. And then you also have to have some consequences, because at some level, if you've done all of this training, and this is, Tyler, maybe where we would agree or disagree, I don't know, I'd be interested in knowing, is if we train our end users and give them every potential to be able to do this, and they still can't do it, my suggestion is they will not change their behavior from training. We know that training will probably never work. So then we're at selective controls, choice prompting, reducing access, two-factor, automatic, mandatory two-factor or multi-factor authentication, whatever it is, because at some point training won't be enough. So in our model, that's how we approach it. It's a systematic long-term investment in matching how you train the employee with detecting whether or not they're actually changing their behavior to be safer online.
I agree with that approach quite a bit, honestly, the behavioral side of this, like applying it. I think at the end of the day, this is a business risk decision. And
yes,
regardless of the employee and regardless of, what we're expecting of them, like they may fail. If we can train them to be better and we can do that in a more efficient manner, that's a good business cost and return on investment. If they cannot do that, we need to still have compensating and mitigating controls in place to protect them so that it's not their job to have to do that if they make a mistake. There's got to be a buffer there, and that is what security's job is to provide that buffer of technology to protect that end user. So it is a nice layer of defense. However, I don't think we should have so much emphasis, and we should definitely make sure that the user is not the one that suffers or is criticized or rebuked when there is a mistake. That is why we have the compensating controls. They are an added asset or an added benefit to the business. And I think that's where most places get this wrong.
Absolutely. I think you're 100% correct. We never blame the user. We incent, encourage, motivate the user. And I think that's what's missing. So even in using phish-prone rates, I can celebrate the fact that I can get your pass rates up to 98%. Wouldn't it be better to say 98% of people can be successfully trained to avoid a hack? Then 2% will still fail. And I guess that's maybe the problem with our whole industry. We really made our colleagues, who are human beings and who behave like human beings will behave, I think we've made them feel like they are the problem, not the solution. And I think that's really haunting a lot of programs we see.
And again, their value to the business, that is another thing that I think the business does not take into consideration is, okay, so they're failing this security control, they're failing this behavioral change. Is what they do for the company still more valuable to have with that risk because what they do is unique to the company? Maybe they are an executive assistant. Maybe they provide a unique bonding capability. Maybe they're HR and they're fantastic at their job. Like, why are we relying and firing people over the fact that they're being asked for additional things on top of their job when their real job they do a great job at? That is the part that I think we just need to get better at.
Yeah, and I want to be careful. Just because we say tying it to a consequences management or to performance management framework doesn't lead to the conclusion you fire somebody, because there are other things we can do. So, for instance, to your point, Tyler, if you have somebody that's really, really valuable, but they're a really significant online risk, what stops you preserving the value of that person by offering them, as an example, with their assistant doing something and having a level of access or control that we don't allow the person to have, right? And this is rapidly what we tell our clients. It's about selective controls. There's a wide range of those, we would agree. I think, Tyler, you could use. And part of that conclusion is, what are the contributions? All quadrants are valuable. These people are making valuable contributions. They form a part of the DNA of our organization. And if you simply took the people out that were security risks, you would deeply impact the performance of that organization. Guaranteed. That's not the best path forward.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to hire and manage talent, if you're constantly firing people for failing phishing.
Right. Exactly. And phishing is only a possible proxy, by the way, for a risk anyway, because in the moment, the phishing campaigns, depending on how they're done, can also be easily identified. So maybe for a different podcast for another time. But the way we do this, before you know it, the notion of a campaign has already been corrupted, because word of the campaign spreads faster than people opening the emails. So that's a whole other issue. But yeah, there's a lot of methodological problems here too.
Yeah. So James, before we wrap here, where can people find you and find some more detail on all the stuff we're talking about here?
Well, they can visit cyberconiq.com, and you'll see lots of white papers there and all kinds of use cases, and you can certainly get information there, or they can reach out to me directly, and I would be happy to have a conversation. You can get me jnorrie at cyberconiq.com or jnorrie@ycp.edu. So there's any number of ways of reaching out. I'm also on LinkedIn, so find us, explore more. We really think we're onto something, and the results that our clients are getting would support that. So if you want to understand what kind of actuarial proof we have that our training is guaranteed to change employee behavior, contact us and you won't regret the conversation.
All right, James, thanks so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thank you. It was really a delight to be here. I had a great conversation, a great time. Take care, everyone.
We'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly Enterprise News.